for making it today. I'm Eon Kuek, the Director of Scientific and Medical Developments for the Citrin Foundation. And it will be my pleasure today to share with you an updated understanding of citrin deficiency and implications on diet. So before I kick off my presentation, two main points about citrin deficiency, or CD for short, that I'd like to kind of point across is the current understanding tells us that citrin deficiency is primarily a liver condition, and in the liver, there's a chronic energy deficiency in a way that the liver isn't able to produce enough energy to support optimal functions. Okay, thank you. And the other thing I'd like to point out is, and again, Barbara has previously mentioned about this, is the presence of RLR. As I said, citrin is primarily a liver condition. That is because there's another protein called RLR that has very similar functions to citrin. And one can think of RLR as sort of like the twin brother of citrin. It does very similar things, but the differentiation is RLR is expressed in other parts of the body. So for example, in citrin deficiency, you may not have citrin in other key organs outside of the liver, the brain, the muscle, but RLR is there to supplement the function of citrin when it's missing. Now, unfortunately, in citrin deficiency, RLR isn't found in the liver. And so that's why in citrin deficiency, you end up with a condition that is primarily affecting the liver. So with that aside, I would now like to talk you through the four main points of my talk today. The first one is to show you how the food that you ingested is ultimately converted into energy. And in the body, energy takes on the form of ATP, which I will touch on in the next slide. And then we take on a more microscopic view into your cells, what happens exactly in your cells that help them make ATP. And then go on to explain to you the role of citrin in energy production and what happens when citrin isn't functioning well. And lastly, telling you the importance of diet in citrin deficiency and why MCT, medium chain triglycerides, are particularly effective in citrin deficiency. And so we all know that we derive energy from food. Food that is ingested is digested, and through metabolism by your cells is broken down and eventually used to make ATP. And as I said, ATP is energy currency of your cell. And essentially, without ATP, we cease to function. And so there are three main categories of food: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And all of these, out of these, primarily carbohydrates are the main way that your body can derive energy from. It's the most efficiently broken down, and it's very easily digested and used to make ATP. To a lesser degree, but also can be used in an alternate source of energy, are fats. And lastly, you have proteins. Compared to fats and carbohydrates, proteins are by far the least efficient in providing ATP. So generally, the body would prefer to use carbs and then fats before reaching to proteins to create ATP. So we'll now take a closer look into your cells and kind of understand exactly what happens to create ATP. So here's an example of a cell. We can think of this as perhaps a liver cell in your liver. And I'd like to draw your attention to this little blue dots here called mitochondria. And what are they? So mitochondria are essentially the power plants of your cells. And in your cells, you have about several thousand mitochondria, and they work around the clock, nonstop, to produce ATP to keep you alive. And so mitochondria are incredibly important in creating energy for you. And so if you take a kind of a closer look into the mitochondria, disclaimer, this is a greatly simplified diagram of how ATP is derived from food. But I hope at the end of this, gives you an understanding of how your mitochondria work. And so in this case, we're going to take glucose, which is from the breakdown of carbohydrates. And when glucose enters your cell, it is metabolized into simple nutrients. These nutrients make their way into the mitochondria. And through a series of reactions, such as which called the TCA cycle, out comes ATP. Now you're going to notice and wonder, what is this thing called NADH? And NADH is essentially a high energy molecule that is produced when food is metabolized. And NADH is very important in driving ATP production. And so the other thing that one needs to know is, in order to drive ATP production, NADH needs to be inside the mitochondria. And so you're going to notice as well in this image here that you have some NADH outside of the mitochondria. And this can be generated as well when carbohydrates are broken down. And so for efficient energy production, NADH outside the mitochondria also needs to be moved into it. And how does that happen? Well, by itself, NADH cannot move straight into the mitochondria. It actually needs some help. And thankfully, the body actually has a clever way to move NADH from the cytosol into the mitochondria to generate ATP. And this is where citrin comes into play. So citrin is part of the system called the malate aspartate shuttle. And this is what helps move NADH from the cytosol into the mitochondria. Now, I'll take you a kind of a deeper look into this system because citrin is part of this. So here we have the white portion inside of the mitochondria, and you can see citrin sitting inside the mitochondria. It's a mitochondrial protein. Now, what citrin does in this shuttle system is it takes an amino acid called aspartate from inside the mitochondria, it moves it out into the cytosol, and in exchange for aspartate, it grabs glutamate from the cytosol, brings it into the mitochondria. When aspartate is outside, it's converted into malate, another kind of amino acid. Malate is then taken into the mitochondria. And this cycle goes on in repeat. Now, some of you may find this hard to comprehend, but the key thing is this cycle goes on in repeat. And the important thing is when this happens, NADH is brought from the cytosol into the mitochondria. And as I said before, NADH is a high energy molecule. Ultimately, NADH drives ATP production. And this is how you derive energy from your food. So to recap, citrin is part of the malate aspartate shuttle. And the malate aspartate shuttle is important because you need to move NADH from the cytosol into the mitochondria. And all this combines, NADH drives ATP production. Now, what happens during citrin deficiency? So in citrin deficiency, due to a genetic mutation in the gene, citrin isn't produced in the body or a faulty copy of the protein is made. And what happens is, expectedly, the malate aspartate shuttle doesn't function well or ceases to function. And as one can expect, what happens is the cell can no longer move NADH from the cytosol into the mitochondria. And what you see here, quite apparently, is you now have a buildup of this NADH molecule in the cytosol. And in biology, an accumulation or a buildup of anything in excess is never a good thing. And this is certainly the case in citrin deficiency. So the accumulation of NADH in the cytosol is thought to underlie a lot of the symptoms associated with citrin deficiency, as well as you can see inside the mitochondria, there's not enough NADH now to drive ATP. So you have a chronic lack of energy being produced in the liver cells. You also notice there's a blockade in the body's ability to break down carbohydrates because the accumulation of NADH in the cytosol actually blocks the body's ability to properly metabolize carbohydrates. The other thing is carbohydrates, as I said before, during its breakdown in the body, it produces more NADH in the cytosol. And so you can see this becomes a vicious cycle, right? If you consume carbohydrates, it makes more NADH, but NADH also blocks the ability of carbohydrates to be broken down. So this is why we understand perhaps why patients do not tolerate carbohydrates well, and many feel pretty sick after eating too much carbs. Now, you may wonder, what about proteins? What about fats? Thankfully, as I said, fats is a good alternate source of energy, and fats, as well as protein to a smaller degree, can still provide energy by producing NADH inside the mitochondria. They don't produce NADH to clog up the system in the cytosol. And as Barbara previously mentioned, in severe cases, when citrin deficiency isn't managed properly, the urea cycle may also be affected. This is because aspartate amino acid that is moved into the cytosol is needed to participate in the urea cycle to clear ammonia from the body in the form of urine. So now that I hope I've given you an idea of why citrin is important and how the body makes ATP. And given this current understanding, thankfully, there are actually a few practical steps that patients can make to improve the management of the condition. So as I shared in the previous slide, there are two key issues here. The first one is the NADH buildup in the cytosol. And as you may have already guessed, what can be done is to reduce the intake of carbohydrates and sugars, because this, as I said, creates NADH buildup. So by reducing carb intake, this helps in this regard. But I would advise not to eliminate entirely carb from the diet because, as I shared at the beginning, other tissues that are non-liver also can benefit from carbohydrates, right? Because you have RLR that can also still use carbs to help your tissues function. And the other very important point that we need to point out is please avoid the consumption of alcohol. Why? It's because alcohol is very specifically broken down in the liver. And the thing about alcohol is when it is metabolized in your liver cells, it produces a ton of NADH. And the NADH, the amount of NADH produced is much more than even carbohydrates. So ultimately, the consumption of alcohol can be very dangerous for CD patients, and we should avoid taking that. The second thing is the energy deficiency in the liver. Again, as I said before, body can derive energy from fats and, again, lesser degree proteins. So having a diet that is low in carbs, high in fats and proteins is beneficial for citrin deficiency. And the other thing is to always take your 3 main meals a day and supplement it between your meals with snacks, have frequent snacks. Never go on an empty stomach, because in citrin deficiency, you want to upkeep a high energy level to provide enough energy for your liver. And the last thing is to supplement your diet with MCT. And in the next slide, I'll show you why MCT is thought to be beneficial for citrin deficiency. So what is MCT? MCT stands for medium chain triglyceride. It is essentially a type of fat. There are many types of fat, and MCT is one of them. But what differentiates MCT from other types of fat in diet is that it's very specific at providing energy for the liver, and it does it very well compared to other types of fat. So other types of fat, when you consume it, it's digested, it tends to kind of distribute across the body, across to other organs, but MCT goes straight to the liver. The other great thing about MCT is once inside the liver, again, compared to other types of fat, it's very efficiently taken up by the mitochondria. And once inside the mitochondria, it goes through a series of reactions. This one called the beta oxidation produces a lot of NADH inside the mitochondria. The metabolism of MCT as well helps with the TCA cycle. But long story short, what happens is MCT is a very efficient means to generate quick energy for the liver to produce ATP. Now that we know that MCT is beneficial, how do you take it? So here, we like to share with you a few tips on how to take MCT. The first thing is we advise not to cook MCT because high heat will spoil MCT. So take it fresh, mix it well. For example, with your 3 main meals, you can mix it with your salads, your drinks like your soup, your smoothies. And at the end of the day, MCT is an oil. So we don't recommend taking MCT alone on an empty stomach, because that will probably give you an upset tummy. And the conversations with our Japanese clinicians recommend a MCT dosing per day of 1 ml per kilogram per day. And so what does that mean in practical terms? So say, for example, a patient weighs 30 kilograms. And so he or she would therefore take in a day 30 mils of MCT divided in 3 doses. So for example, 10 mils in breakfast, 10 mils for lunch, 10 mils for dinner, combined to 30 mils. But there is a maximum amount of MCT that one can tolerate a day, and that is 40 mils maximum. So if someone weighs, for example, 60 kilograms, they would still adhere to the maximum of 40 mils MCT per day. As well, everyone has different tolerances to MCT, so we advise adjusting it according to what your body can take. And lastly is to take MCT moderately according to your caloric needs. So for example, if MCT provides you with a good amount of energy for about, for example, 15% of your daily caloric needs, then perhaps you could, reduce the amount of carbohydrates taken if you feel that you have enough energy. And so that brings me to the end of my talk. I would like to conclude, in my talk today, I've shown you hopefully how your cells convert food into energy in the form of ATP, and the importance of citrin in the overall picture of what citrin does to support ATP generation and what happens when citrin isn't working properly. And lastly, the importance of diet and MCT in citrin deficiency. Now, if there's anything I would like for you to take home today, are these 3 main points. First one is to maintain a diet that is low in carbs, high in protein, high in fats. Have frequent your 3 main meals and have frequent snacks in between. Never go on an empty stomach. And lastly, to take MCT, the recommended dosing. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention today. And I will now pass on the presentation to my colleague, Shema Azakawi. Thank you very much.